Hello there, and welcome back to the Growing On podcast. In this episode, we're tackling one of the biggest challenges facing American agriculture today, and that's labor. The fruits and vegetables we all rely on don't just grow themselves. Behind every harvest is a workforce, and behind that workforce is a complicated and costly system. The H2A guest worker program was designed to help farmers find reliable, legal labor, but in recent years, it's become an overwhelming financial burden. Wage rates have skyrocketed 34% in just 3 years, and growers are struggling to keep up. Joining me today is Chris Butts, Executive Vice President of the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, to break down what this means for farmers, consumers, and the future of American grown produce. Stick around, this is a conversation you don't want to miss. Let's dive in. Well, I'm happy to have Chris Butts on the line with me today. Chris is the Executive Vice President of the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association. How are you, Chris?
Doing great. Thank you for the opportunity, John. Always glad to talk about ag and H2A in particular.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. I know. Life's busy this time of year, so I do appreciate the time that you are giving me today to talk about an important topic, one that me and you definitely see as important. I feel like every time we meet, we are talking about it, and that is H2A guest worker programs that the United States has. Chris, just to kind of get us started with this conversation, kind of give us a bird's eye view, if you will, for those listening that, our audience, some of them probably, I'm sure, are well versed in it. But those that may not exactly know, explain what our guest worker programs are, and why they're in place, I guess.
Okay. So the H2A program is administered primarily by the United States Department of Agriculture and Department of Labor, but I believe there are as many as 7 different agencies that at different times may have a hand in the process. But it's essentially an agricultural guest worker program for folks that come on a temporary and seasonal basis to fill ag jobs here in the United States that would otherwise go unfilled from a lack of a domestic workforce. So in Georgia, and especially crops, fruits, and vegetables in particular, it's a critical program. Most of the produce that you see in the store, by the time it gets on those grocery shelves, it's been touched by hand 4 or 5 different times in the planting process, to caring for that plant, to harvesting the fruit and vegetable and packing it and getting it to the store. Whereas the traditional, some other row crops are much more automated and much more mechanized. The technology just isn't there yet to replace those experienced human hands in the field producing and harvesting those crops. So the unfortunate reality we find ourselves in is there's not much of a domestic workforce that's interested in doing that work. Especially here in Georgia, it's hot and dry in the summer, and it's hard work. And our growers over the years have tried everything to attract more domestic workers, but they're just not there. So the H2A program really provides a lifeline to us to enable us to get a documented, reliable, and legal workforce, and also an experienced workforce that can come in and on a temporary basis and help fill those labor voids in the ag community.
Awesome. Yeah. So, like you touched on it, a lot of different facets of agriculture use those workers, but specifically for today's purposes and for what, for the organization that you work for, we're going to kind of focus it more for fruit and vegetable growers. And like you said, obviously much needed in that sector of the ag industry. And you mentioned skilled. What is how do you, when you say skilled and you say, kind of give us give us an idea of kind of why that is so important. I think a lot of people would be, interested to know that a lot of these workers actually, from my understanding at least, come back year after year, possibly to the same farm. Is that correct?
That's correct, and it's one of the things when there are criticisms of the program, it's one of the first things that we point out. Unfortunately, there aren't any hard statistics on it, but if you go to our growers, a lot of them will tell you that 95% of their workforce comes back year after year through the program. And through those years, they become experienced. And, It's the reason that there's not technology and mechanization to go into a peach orchard yet, to go do the thinning, and the somewhat technical work of thinning that tree, pruning the tree, and then when it comes harvest time, of knowing which fruit to pick when. We don't have the technology there to do that yet. Likewise, it takes a number of years for a worker to gain all those skills, and as they come back year after year, they're building on those skills and building their resume just like anybody else. So the ability to bring in a worker that is experienced and has the skills to jump right into production is really important, as opposed to bringing in inexperienced workers that it may be their first time. There's a great deal of training and coaching that goes into that. So the ability to bring back those experienced workers that have the skills to go out in that field and make those determinations on the fly is really, really important. But it also speaks to what I think is the positive nature of the program. It provides an opportunity for those workers to come here and gain wages. While they're here, we're paying their transportation and their housing and their food. So theoretically, they should be able to save up a lot of that money and go back home. So it provides an opportunity for the worker. It certainly fills a void for the growers. So it's a win-win, and when done correctly, and you have those workers returning year after year, to me, it tells us that it's a good opportunity for those workers, and it's a good opportunity for the growers.
A key word there is when it's done correctly, right? So with that being said, that's one reason why I wanted to do this, have this discussion with you, is because H2A has been a big topic of concern, or big topic of discussion rather. I would say probably the last 3 years, I think, probably maybe four, times a flat circle, honestly. But like I said, you and I talk about this every time I see you. So, but that being said, though, when you say done correctly, obviously that implies that there are areas or instances where it could be improved. With that being said, what are some of those things, like in your eyes, that with your organization, with the growers that you talk to, deal with, what are some of those, I guess, issues or challenges that those programs do have do present for a lot of our growers?
Right. I think there's two sides of that coin. One is, we always say that we're working hard to provide our growers the information so that they can stay on the right side of compliance, so that they're compliant with the rules. And we go to great lengths, and we work closely with Farm Bureau and lots of other ag organizations to do that. That's why we put on events like the Georgia Ag Labor Forum each fall. It's a 2-day deep dive into the regulations and changing regulations that govern the program. So it's up to the industry, it's up to us as growers, and as a collective group, to make sure that we're making all efforts that we can to operate in compliance with the rules of the program, first and foremost. And when someone is not, when someone chooses to work outside the parameters of the program and the rules, that hurts us all, and we condemn those actions. And certainly, that makes the program harder for all the other users to use successfully going forward. So when there are bad actors, we need to correct that problem. And if necessary, that may be somebody that doesn't need to participate in the program in the future. That's one side. The flip side is when those regulations and rules become just overbearing and so burdensome to the grower that it becomes cost prohibitive for them, just from a time standpoint of being able to administer the program. So what you see is many of our growers will utilize outside service providers that can help them complete the paperwork and all the application, and then jump through the various red tape that you got to get through to get your workers here on site. Then other farms will use what's called farm labor contractors, and those are guys that are kind of a turnkey operation for the grower that they handle the paperwork, they handle all the application fees, they bring the workers and help administer the work while it's going on in the field. So where we get into trouble is when those two sides of the coin get out of balance. And we feel like that's happened over the last 2 to 3 years. There've been some very onerous rules that have come out that really, in our opinion, were beyond the authority of the agencies that put forth those rules, and went beyond the authority that Congress ever envisioned granting those agencies to administer the program. So when those rules become overburdensome or too heavy, and become where it costs growers just time and time, because time is money, that's when we get out of balance and where we have a problem. So the program is a critical lifeline for us. Unfortunately, in the last few years, we've just seen that paperwork burden and the administrative cost of operating on the right side of compliance are really putting a squeeze on growers. And that's before we even start to talk about the wage rates that have increased. So the complexity of the program can be a problem. It certainly can be intimidating and limit new growers that want to utilize the program. And that's a shame, because we've got to make it the program where it's as accessible for a small grower that may need 1 to 2 workers as it is for a large grower that may need 500 or 600.
Gotcha. Also, I was, as you and I discussed before we got on here, I was in DC this week and heard a very startling statistic. It was just to get a guest worker, H2A worker to the farm, it costs growers roughly about $10,000, $11,000, and then the average H2A farm, or the average number of H2A workers you can find on a farm is about 32. So if you do quick math, $320,000 for the cost of getting those workers to the farm. I mean, I don't even know, like, that's hard to fathom. And like you said, on top of that, that's not even including all the other costs, like all the other costs of housing, transportation, and paying them the wage that they have to get while they're working, which I can't. That was so baffling to me, and I couldn't. I'd been around this issue, like I said, for years, and that was just gosh, it was just crazy to hear. And to that point, that the administrative cost is absurd. Like that is so wild to me, and no wonder, like the message that we've been talking about is growers are struggling. Like this is the cost associated with this is crazy.
Yep. So. And it speaks to the need for the program. The fact that a grower is willing and or doesn't have a choice other than to pay those upfront costs, which the grower is responsible for the application fees and various fees to get those applications to those various agencies. And then they're responsible for getting that worker from their home country all the way to the farm. For all legs of that transportation, the grower is responsible there. So the fact that they're willing and able to absorb those costs tells you just how desperate they are for that labor, and that they don't have any other source. And to your point, all of that is before they get to the farm and before the first fruit or vegetable is picked and before the first wage, the actual wage is paid. So it's a great burden on the grower. And aside from the money that's invested, again, I'll go back to the time and just the number of hours that you've got to be able to devote to getting that application through the process. And if you're doing it yourself, it's going to be a lot more time. And then if you're having to use an outside service, it's going to add even more to those costs. So the upfront costs are considerable. And the commitment to being in the program is something a grower really needs to think about before deciding to be an H2A user.
Correct. Yeah, that's wild. So we mentioned a couple times if once you get them to the farm, then you have other costs, and I don't know exactly all the different things. I know that housing is one of them, transportation to and from their housing to the fields, and then transportation. I believe that they are required to allow them to go into town for stuff, I believe, too. And you can dive into any of this, by the way. I was wanting to get kind of to the wage rate, because we've mentioned that a couple times. Help me and help anyone listening understand. It's a term. It's big, and I'm sure it's probably convoluted on how it works. But the adverse effect wage rate. What exactly is that, and talk to the once you get past the administrative burden of how that's a new burden for farmers, and how it's been even more burdensome in the last few years, for sure.
Yeah. So like you said, aside from those upfront costs, that grower's got to reimburse the worker for his trip all the way from home to the workplace. Like you said, they are then responsible for providing transportation each day from the housing that is also employer provided to the field, and then the housing itself is required to be provided free of charge for those workers for their entire stay. And we work closely with WorkSource Georgia. That's the Georgia agency that works with our growers to come in and do those housing inspections and all. But it's a pretty meticulous list of requirements that govern how that housing can be set up and utilized. And that's an added expense for the growers for sure. And again, that's all before the growers come, before the workers come here and done any work. So they come here. How much are we going to pay them? Well, that's determined by what's called the adverse effect wage rate, as you mentioned. And that rate is set by USDA and Department of Labor. And each year they do a farm labor survey in which they survey growers in an attempt to gain an understanding of what real farm wages are being paid. Convoluted is a word that you used a minute ago to describe it, and that's I would say that's a nice way of saying it at this point. The Farm Labor Survey, I was in a room a couple of years ago with a couple of hundred growers and a congressman, and the congressman asked all the growers, raise your hand if you've ever received a Farm Labor Survey, and none of the growers could raise their hand. And just anecdotally speaking to the GFEJ members, in 2024, I believe we had one member that reported receiving a survey. I know we've had more in 25 that already have, but for a long time, we weren't real sure exactly who was responding to those surveys. So who is USDA surveying, who is responding is one question that we have. And then looking at their answers and what information USDA is seeking, one of the largest problems is the survey includes H2A wages. And when that does, it really just becomes kind of an echo chamber. And that the data that comes out of that survey each year is going to increase because of the inclusion of those H2A wages. So that adverse effect wage rate, they take the numbers from the survey and they put it in this little magical black box, and out the other side pops what is essentially the minimum wage rate for H2A workers. It's the minimum wage that growers are required to pay H2A workers while here. That rate has gone up 34% in the last 3 years. And is now at $16.08 per hour, which is more than twice the federal minimum wage. And when you add those other expenses of transportation, food, and housing back to that wage, the real world impact wage the grower is paying is somewhere north of $20 an hour for this work. And growers can sustain increases in wages. Everybody's wages, especially the last few years, have gone up. What growers can't sustain is double-digit increases year after year after year. And that wage is set each December. That grower may already have contracts for produce for that coming spring. And if USDA and DOL decides that the pay rates are going up, that farmer is going to have to absorb that increase because he already has a contract with this Kroger or Walmart or other distributor at a set price. So it's really next to impossible for a grower to ever be able to recoup those costs.
That is wild to me. More than double. I mean, if you really think about it, I mean, you might have a McDonald's worker down the street that is making less than someone in this program. To me, like you said, it's more than double. The wage rate itself is more than double, and when you add all those factors in, it's over $20. That is crazy. I guess.
I was going to say the most aggravating thing or frustrating thing about that, John, is that we are requiring U.S. producers to pay foreign guest workers twice what we require a U.S. citizen to be paid, and that's problematic.
Yeah, that's problematic, and only to your point, 34%, and how many years has that been? The 34% increase
over the last 3 years, 23, 4, and 5.
You know how many people would love to have a 34% pay increase in 3 years? That's mind-boggling. And another part of that, like to your point, like no one, contrary to how it's politicized, I think, no one doesn't want to pay these workers. Like to your point, like you said earlier, it should speak to how needed these programs are. And farmers are willing to pay that price, but like to follow up with something else you said, you cannot plan for 34% in 3 years. I don't know how any business could still be alive in that way.
Yeah, I believe it was in 2022. Social Security that year had the largest cost of living increase in the history of the program. So, their economists and experts looked and said, hey, it's inflation and other factors are putting the squeeze on our Social Security recipients. We need to raise the cost of living adjustment. I believe it was 8%. I believe that same year, the A-ware went up 11%. So, it's really just disjointed from what we think are the economic realities in our communities. And the frustrating part is we have worked with Congress, we've worked with USDA, we've worked with with DOL, and we've even filed 2 Freedom of Information requests with both agencies in an attempt to just simply gain a better understanding of how the survey works and how they take the information obtained from those surveys, manipulate that data, and come up with the wage. And there's just a real lack of transparency there. And that's even more frustrating to our growers. It's one thing when you give them a 34% increase over 3 years. It's another thing when you do it and you can't tell them why. And again, it's disjointed from the economic realities of what's going on around them in their local rural communities. And it also becomes the corresponding or the de facto minimum wage for any domestic workers that you might be able to locate. One of the rules of the program is if you're paying the guest worker 1608, you have to pay any domestic workers a corresponding wage to that. So it becomes the de facto minimum wage in that area for that agricultural work, which is really just putting a squeeze on our guys.
So another to piggyback on all of this, I think what maybe people know. Like I said, those that listen, those that are in agriculture are well aware of this. Is on top of this 34% increase and all these different increases in the cost of the program itself is on top of just being able to grow the crop itself. And I'm sure, like, not even in the dive into that aspect. With that being said, though, what do you hear from growers? I mean, obviously, I'm sure displeasure, and probably a little bit of frustration, to say the least. But how are growers surviving this? If they are.
Yeah. It's tough. The industry in Georgia, the demand for Georgia grown fruits and vegetables is growing. And we have so many things going here from us, from our climate to our soil, to our airport, to our interstate, to our ports. There's lots of good infrastructure that says, hey, Georgia's set to help feed our country. But for the growers that have to keep absorbing those pay increases, there comes a limit where they can't do it anymore. And to your point, coming through COVID, we've all certainly seen the input costs rise across the board and just general inflation across the board. And then you tack these wage increases on top of it. The only recourse a grower has at that point is to bring in fewer workers. And when we do that, you can't just shift a field where you were growing bell peppers last year with plasticulture and all the infrastructure that goes into that, drip tape and irrigation. You can't readily flip that field over and decide, hey, I'm just going to grow peanuts here. You've got too much invested in that land and the infrastructure already. And, an acre of peppers is going to produce a lot more revenue than an acre of cotton does. So it's not so easy to just say, hey, we're not going to do that. We'll just shift to something else that doesn't require the labor. So the only recourse a grower has is to bring in fewer workers, which means we're putting less acreage in production in Georgia for fruits and vegetables, which ultimately means we're driving production out of the state, back to Mexico and other countries that are growing and sending in super cheap imports of those commodities. So we're putting squeeze on our growers, and we're going to force more of that production out of the country. And our concern there is we become dependent on those other countries for our fruits and vegetables. And I'll bring up COVID again, and you've heard me say this before, John. We had shortages in every section of the grocery store during COVID. We couldn't get toilet paper. We couldn't get cleaning products, lots of things we couldn't get. The produce section remained full, and we credit that to the resiliency of the American farmer. But if we become dependent on Mexico and Chile and Peru and all these other countries for our food, the next time there's a supply chain interruption, we might not be so lucky. So the H2A program and the wages and the burden that we're placing on American growers ultimately leaves them on an unlevel playing field and susceptible to foreign competitors that don't have those same wage requirements, don't have the same food safety requirements. And it's really leaving our guys at a disadvantage, and their only recourse is to pull back on production. But ironically, we see the program continuing to grow. continuing to grow in Georgia because of that demand is there. And also it just speaks to, again, there is not a domestic workforce that a reliable domestic workforce that a grower can utilize. We've got to have this program.
So I guess my one thought I have, or my next question for you is, what I guess what needs to be done to change this? I guess, is there any hope for the future of any of these things kind of coming under control? I mean, it seems, from the outside looking in, and from speaking to growers, speaking with you, I feel like this has been the tale that has to be told. You know what I mean? And so, is there any end in sight of this, or are there any solutions or anything that's possibly being done that could help with this? Or, I know that's kind of generalistic, but I don't, at this point, if anybody hearing this, or anybody that's looking into this, is seeing the same thing that we are seeing, and it's like watching it. It seems as if you're watching a train wreck, and all you can do is sit there and watch. You know what I mean?
Yeah, in slow motion.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are certainly revisions that can be made, and we would start with that adverse effect wage rate and returning it to a rate that is more in line with what's really happening in South Georgia, what's really happening economically in California and in Florida. Let's return those wages to where those growers can be competitive, but also where it provides that opportunity for the worker. And this is an anecdotal story, John. We had a grower that called me and said his workers actually came to him this year and said, "Hey, we know that you're required to keep doing these pay increases, but we also know that ultimately that's going to harm you and may mean that we don't get to come back here to work." So the worker was literally coming to the grower and saying, if you don't want to pay us quite as much as they're saying you have to, we would understand. Of course, the grower can't do that, but it's gotten so out of control that even the workers are realizing it's unsustainable. So we're trying every path we can. We're certainly working with the new Trump administration, and met just yesterday with newly sworn in Secretary of Ag Brooke Rollins. She was in Georgia. We met with her at the Capitol, and were able to present her with a letter that was signed by Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones and most of the Republican caucus in the Senate that outlined the challenges that the A represents. And then we met with her later in the day with a farmer and grower roundtable. And there were 4 fruit and vegetable growers on that panel. And a new study from the University of Georgia that shows what the economic impacts are of those AWR increases and the negative impact that those increases are having on farm net income, net margin, and the ability for growers to access capital into the future to keep those farming operations growing. So there's congressional fixes. Congress can certainly mandate that USDA and DOL go back and realign these wages. The administration has the authority to do some relief, I think, in that arena, just through rule changes. And then we continue to work for, just more transparency. Help us understand how you come up with these rates. Help us understand the program better so that we make sure it still provides an opportunity for workers and people will want to come here and work, and that we still provide an opportunity for those growers to have a reliable workforce.
Awesome, Chris. Well, I certainly thank you for the time. Like I said, I know life's busy this time of year, but I do appreciate some of your time today. Obviously, this is going to probably be an ongoing discussion, hopefully for the better. Hopefully next time I see you, we can actually have a positive note to speak about. But I do appreciate you joining me this afternoon for sure. I think it was a good discussion.
Yeah, well, we appreciate the opportunity. We always appreciate the partnership with Georgia Farm Bureau, and it's going to take us all working together to bring about meaningful change. But we've got to do it. We don't have a choice. We clearly know that the path we're on is not sustainable. So let's do something to level the playing field for Georgia growers and all American growers, and make sure that our citizens and our customers and our shoppers at the stores, when they go in there, that there's plenty of healthy and fresh fruits and vegetables for them that are raised here in the United States.
Awesome, for sure. Thanks again, Chris. Great talking with you, and I'll see you soon, I'm sure.
All right, thanks, John.
All right, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Growing On podcast. If you haven't done so already, please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. That would be greatly appreciated. And as always, be on the lookout in the coming weeks for our next episode. Take care, everybody.